And we are live. Welcome back for episode 3 of First of All, How We Cope. My name is Sasha Simon. I'm the Safety First Program Manager at the Drug Policy Alliance. And this series is all about a harm reduction based approach to drug policy issues and to drug education. Throughout the series, and especially today, we're going to be tying in different issues, particularly the issues along the margins, more taboo issues that we typically don't have the space to share. Taboo issues like sexual assault, living with HIV, um, having an undocumented family member, or even, having a family member that's been deported, and the pain and the trauma that can be experienced through living through those types of scenarios or living through that type of victimization. Those are all very prevalent and quite obvious reasons why we all cope. But often we silence those conversations, we marginalize those conversations, and we stigmatize those conversations more broadly, and we often don't give room for survivors to be able to speak. And, the catchy saying is you have to reveal it to heal it. So if you don't give that space to be able to speak to the pain, to speak to the trauma that's been caused to individuals or to communities by individuals or particular policies in particular, how can you fix it? How can you have justice? How can you really restore the harms that have taken place? And how can you do better and how can you do differently? So today's episode is really about talking about those issues that we've got. Um, One of the things as complicated and anxiety producing as the COVID-19 pandemic has been, one of the things that it's done a really good job of revealing is the fact that we have issues, and we've all got issues. Um, and throughout your lifetime, you'll develop some type of issue, right? Um, and for a number of different reasons. And what I appreciate about this moment is oftentimes within the K through 12 system, we don't talk to young people about mental health or mental hygiene or how to recognize the signs of stress or anxiety in themselves or in other people. Or we often think that or we frame it in such a way that mental health is something off over there to the side. It's kind of tangential, and it's only something that you approach maybe if something traumatic enough happens. And once you reach adulthood, you know that something sure enough traumatic is going to happen, or there's just going to be something in your life that happens that's just too much to carry. And you will need support, and you will need to be able to recognize when you need that support. And fortunately and unfortunately, the COVID pandemic has been a great opportunity to really show that and highlight that for young people and not allow that conversation to wait until they might become older and experience something traumatic and maybe not seek out the support that they need. It's a good time to just have that conversation now and encourage that health-seeking behavior now. So I'll have a few guests on with me today. The first one is Kim Kennedy Griffith. She is the reproductive health manager at the Red Hook Initiative, and she is also a spokesmodel for HIV Stops With Me campaign. Let me pull you in here with me. Hey, Kim.
Hey,
How you doing?
I'm good. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. It's Monday. It's a rainy Monday in New York, and it feels like it. And I think it's a good day to talk about all the reasons why we cope. What do you think?
I think this is a perfect day.
So Kim and I have had a long history together as co-facilitators and health educators. And we originally started teaching an HIV prevention and young women or young girls empowerment program in high schools and after school program. It was called Leap for Girls. And I think we've been in pretty much every different borough at this point. And I know what brought me to that work. And I know what has made me really appreciate you in that work and appreciate you now in this moment and how you've expanded beyond that. But I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about what brought you into HIV prevention. What is your story? And yeah, what also brought you to Red Hook?
So, what got me started was honestly, I was somebody who needed a job, and I'm gonna be totally upfront. I think that's how most teenagers um, kind of started doing the work in a sense. So for me, it was I needed a job. My sister, my older sister, when I was like 6, 7, would take me with her to her jobs, which was like peer education. She was teaching out in SUNY Downstate and would take me along with her anytime she did workshops. And I would go with her. I would watch her. I would see her do the stuff. And as I got older, I really needed to do something. I was like about 15, and she told me, like, reach out to the people. You'll have a job interview. And I started peer education at 15. Before that, what made me want to stick to peer education and what made me realize, like, okay, I really like this was growing up. I was born with HIV, still HIV positive. It didn't go away. Um, both my parents were IV drug users. I didn't find out till I was 9, a week before my 10th birthday. And it messed me up in a way where I never really got to express myself on like the impact of what knowing me being HIV positive was, understanding what that is, um, not really having a relationship with my parents because they both died right before I found out that I was positive. And that really played a toll on my mental health, my physical health, and just how I viewed people and how I viewed myself for a really long time. So when it was time for me to find a job, and my sister was like, help education, I'm like, it kind of kills two birds with one stone. I got out of the phase of being destructive with my life and cutting school and doing everything that's like defiant of what a kid should supposed to be doing, especially growing up in a religious household. And I decided, okay, I'm gonna go do this. I'm gonna be a health educator and learn the stuff about what is HIV, what is sexual health, learn about pregnancy, learn about the taboo issues that nobody talk about. And I want to say again, living in a religious household, that's something that my grandmother really didn't teach. It was, you'll learn it later on, but it's stay in a child's place. And as I got to learn more about it, it was, oh, okay, I have a voice. I can speak on it. These are things that my friends are talking about, and we literally have no clue on what we're talking about because I'm learning this in a hospital and I have all the facts in front of me, and they're saying something else, and I'm like, no, that's not what this is. This is totally wrong. And we're all just sharing misinformation with each other. And I'm the one who basically has like the goods. I'm like, oh no, this is, let me share it with you. This is what's really going on. This is what you can do. This is where you can go. Oh, you need condoms? I got you. I got condoms in my pocket. Oh, wait, nope, I got condoms at home. So I wound up being like the condom lady for like the teenagers. And when I was growing up, I was like the one who had the resources of where do you go? What do you do? What happens if I see this? And I'm always telling people, I'm not a doctor. I just have the information, but I'm gonna tell you to go to a doctor. But this is what it sounds like. You should really go get checked out. So that's the role that I played. And what brought me to Red Hook was I was finishing school and I was almost done with my bachelor's degree. I had my last year and I wasn't really looking for a job. I was just like, I should be doing something. They don't really tell you the steps of after you graduate from college. They say you need a job, but they don't really tell you, what to do, how to do it. There wasn't like a whole toolkit of that I got that maybe others did, but I didn't. And I reached out to a friend and she told me that the job was hiring and I went for the interview. Didn't We don't even know each other, and I got the job. I was the best candidate. I've been doing this work since I was about 14, 15. So for me, I had all this wealth and knowledge that played perfect for me to be in Red Hook, organization that's great, that really loves the community, that loves the kids, um, that prides itself in making sure that we employ um, people from Red Hook into the community so that way they can have opportunities, they can have job training, So I play a really major part in that with me doing reproductive health, where I get to accompany the students, or accompany not just the students, but the people in the community to like their first health clinic, which if anybody has been to a GYN visit or a doctor's visit, period, it can be a very traumatic event. Like, we're not even talking about the past trauma that you might experience before going to the doctor, but actually being in the doctor and them not actually talking to you through the process of this is what's going to happen. So I kind of play a major role in that, of explaining what's going to happen when you go to the doctor. So that way it's a less traumatic event, taking more of a trauma informed care approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that, at least for me, and I know that a lot of the young people that we've worked with over the years, one thing that we really love about you is the fact that you're open and you're candid about your story, and you find a way to really make it accessible and make it a teaching opportunity. And the fact that you're present, you're a spokesmodel, you're on billboards, you're everywhere, but your presence also allows your relationships to be present too. And I've enjoyed being facilitators with you, but also being a friend with you and displaying for other young women what it's like to just be a friend with someone who's living with HIV. Like the fact that I will absolutely eat all of your food, and drink anything you bring to session, because I know science, right? And I'm
Yeah.
not scared of eating behind you or anything like that. I know better, and we take those opportunities to teach young people, like, if saliva is if you were ever going to be transmitted HIV, through saliva, you would have to have a whole gallon of it, and I'm not going through a gallon of your saliva, Kim.
Yeah,
So
that's, I don't even want to go through a gallon of mine.
not, yeah, I bet not. I bet
Yeah.
not. Um, but I think that's the power of science and the power of living out, the science, and allowing you to be able to do that within community, and to be able to do that just out loud and proud, and with respect and with dignity, and also letting other people know that, like, you're not the scary one, like, we're the scary ones. Like, I always have to
Hmm.
be very mindful of how I'm doing and how I feel before I'm in your presence, because I care about you, and I know that if anybody's defiled, dirty, all these ridiculous concepts that people attach with being HIV positive, it's not the HIV positive person,
Hmm.
And I think that's the unfortunate, stigma that needs to be and continues to be broken.
Yeah.
Um, I was hoping you could speak a little bit, about the trials and mental health needs of long-term survivors living with HIV.
So I'll speak on, I've been 33 years positive, and hopefully December will be 34. Oop, oop. So looking for my birthday. But
Yeah.
and hopefully we're not in quarantine. But for me, as somebody who is perennially infected, who has been living with this my whole life, it's growing up, it was forced upon me to go to counseling. And growing up positive in the 80s, in the 90s, where there was no medication, HIV, it's kind of not similar to kind of COVID if you look at it, where there's misinformation, information is always being updated, but everybody has different things of what they think is going on. And they
Hmm.
feel that they have to separate away from people totally, but so that way they wouldn't get infected. And COVID is different, but in the same part of that scare tactic, or that stigma that is attached to it, it's always going to be attached to somebody else. So for me, it's that internal stigma that I faced growing up that made me not want to go to therapy, that having to go to therapy because I literally was kind of losing my mind as a kid and was doing the most outrageous things, that made that they had to take me to therapy. And I'm sitting there looking at them like, I don't want to talk to you. We just gonna sit here for 45 minutes and stare at each other. To then know that as I get older, no, this is something that I need. Like my husband, my sisters, my friends are like, no, you should really go to therapy. And it really took for me to kind of things that I thought that I processed, breaking open out of that box. that I nicely compacted it in, exploding in my face where I'm having anxiety attacks and I can't process real life things or things that I would normally cry about. I'm watching a commercial and I'm crying and I'm not a crier. And it was like, maybe I need to go talk to somebody. Maybe I need to get some help. And and I had to accept that for myself, because it's, how do I be selfish and say, no, I'm going to carve out some time for myself to go get the necessary help that I need for me to process during the week, so that way I can help and counsel somebody else at work. And it took me a really long time to actually get that through my head that it was okay, because a lot of us growing up didn't have that option, or at least didn't want that, because it was somebody else telling us what we had to do. And now as adults, we don't have that person telling us that this is what we should be doing. It's looked at as taboo. It's looked at as, in our community, that you don't need help, that you need to push through because you have to take care of everybody else. And it's, again, with somebody as a long-term survivor, is, why am I even here? How am I still here? So that plays on a part right there, where it's like, should I even be selfish enough to go do that? Because I'm 33. This isn't a map of where I should be going. So it plays a lot with trying to go get care, especially when you're taking care of somebody else. I have a 10-year-old and I have a husband and I have like 60 kids at work. So
Yeah.
it's I'm like always helping my community, but I always forget to take care of myself.
I mean, I think you just spoke to an intersection and a conflict that many of us face, especially many of us as women of color and Black women who are used to being caretakers and taking care of everyone else. And we might even preach preach the gospel of wellness, of mental health, of taking care of yourself, and still not do that,
Mhm.
because we have our own culturally ingrained patterns of not doing that, of not
Mhm.
prioritizing that. And it often takes a breakdown or someone bringing it to our attention that, like, you know, girl, maybe you should take some rest, or
Yeah.
maybe you should talk to somebody because the weight is too much. And I think that we have to, you know, come to a place where saying that weight is too much is okay for each other. Um, Kim, I appreciate everything that you shared and you sharing your story as always. I'm going to put you on pause, so that I can pull up our next guest, and I'm going to pull you back in later this episode.
No problem.
All right, Kim. So our next guest today is Ksenia Voropaeva. She is a board member of the organization About Face Veterans Against the War. How are you doing, Ksenia?
Great. Great to be here.
Good, good. Could you tell us a little bit about Face?
Yes, absolutely. We're a organization of post 9/11 service members and veterans, organizing to end a foreign policy of permanent war and the use of military weapons, tactics, and values in our communities. Um, Originally, this is an organization that formed after some troops returned in 2004 of the invasion of Iraq, and began speaking out about the lies of the wars. And so we're an organization that's informed by veteran organizing during the Vietnam era, by Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And so we're kind of continuing a legacy of veterans returning and wanting to build a better world. Um, and Our organizing is rooted in transformational organizing. So we want to transform ourselves, having been kind of trained and really learned, really hierarchical, patriarchal systems, and being part of it. We want to return and change that within ourselves and our society.
Wonderfully stated. And powerfully stated. It's a powerful mission, and I think that every About Face member that I've met has a powerful story. And so you told me a bit about your story, and I learned a lot. I learned a whole lot. I became aware of my own ignorance around, you know, the military and the hierarchies there, and even my own ignorance between the difference between being enlisted and being commissioned. And so I'm hoping that you can share a bit about your own story being commissioned into the military.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I can say that, you know, when I was looking and started considering the military as an option, I honestly didn't know myself the difference between enlisted and officer, even though, you know, I originally wasn't born in this country. I was born in the former Soviet Union. And I moved here into a military family. You know, my stepfather is a Vietnam veteran. But yeah, I started considering service really as a what I call as a economic draft. I was growing up in Oklahoma, and it was 2008, 2009, and I this for me was the best option to really, you know, move on from Oklahoma and find other ways to better myself. And so I found the Air Force, and specifically the ROTC program. And you know, it was, you know, looking back, I was young, and the military really teaches you like values, and it tells you about how it really, you know, that you can really challenge yourself and others. And so yeah, I did the ROTC program. I said I'm the point of connection to a lot of the work that you do is that during those years in college, myself and other cadets, you know, what happened was at times we were threatened to lose our commissioning if, you know, we had members engage in underage drinking or drugs, and then so they would be threatened that they would lose their scholarship and have to pay their money back. So already it's kind of a relationship of you sign this contract, but you can be kind of threatened in a disciplinary way. And there were moments where that happened to me during those years in college. So yeah, so I what did end up happening is I received the job of logistics officer in the United States Air Force, and my service immediately, you know, a week after graduation, I was sent overseas. There's some training in overseas, but yeah, I served in all overseas locations because there's military bases, you know, all over the world, as well as inside the United States. And I want to make sure I get your question.
Thank you.
Let's see. Yeah, and my experience, so I say that I was stationed overseas is I did not deploy, even though there are moments where I could have possibly deployed, but I've done exercises in different countries while being stationed abroad. But you know, as a 24-year-old, I was charged with taking care of enlisted soldiers that were deploying, you know, that were going out into combat and then returning to their home station, whether it's in Japan or in Germany. And so that was my interaction with in the military. And after my service, I guess some of the points of connection to the topics that we're speaking about is I did experience a military sexual trauma, which towards the end of my service, and since I've been out, has really been what I've focused on, of what I've had to make a priority to kind of heal myself and heal my what sometimes are called invisible wounds, but really you know, something that greatly affected me in my service in the Air Force.
Thank you for sharing that. And you had shared that with me as well. had granted permission to speak about that today.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I thought was very compelling about your story towards healing from that assault is the process of justice and retribution, and kind of what was to be decided about and for your perpetrator and in that process. And so I'm hoping, if you don't mind, if you could speak a little bit about that, what that was like, because I think that's a common, it's a common story around many victims of any type of abuse or assault, and I think it's a powerful one.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciate you giving the space to kind of talk about it. This is something that's taken me years to get to a place where I can discuss. And there's a lot of, just the way, I guess, the way that I think the initial point of like how assaults are handled in the military, I think it's, it's a long discussion, can be a very long discussion. I know that it sometimes differs in different services of how response happens. Just understanding the complexity of this type of crime happening in overseas location, like it did with me. But I think so. There's lots of nuances. When I was in the Air Force for victims, they provided sort of two pathways. You can either have a restricted report where you are. It's said that you're would be given the medical help that you need, whether you need support afterwards with therapy, but your chain of command would not find out what happened when you went to get help after the incident. That's called a restricted report, and that's what I chose to do. And so, I just want to name that because each member experiences this in a very, very different way. Your restricted report means everyone in your unit and your chain of command. There's investigators that are brought in, find out about what happened. So I chose a restricted option. That means I had to kind of carry that with me for a long time afterwards. And I named that again, this was a process. So once that kind of time passed and I did get out of the military, I went to the VA and I was able to get services because, I had a honorable discharge, meaning I had access to healthcare, to education benefits and such. There's ways that happen that our members don't, military members don't get, they get their benefits taken away, and we can talk about that later. But and so the next phase was me interacting with the VA to try to get a handle of the symptoms that I was experiencing, the PTSD, of the post-traumatic stress that I was experiencing, and that I needed to and that resulted in me also, a lot of survivors of military sexual trauma get denied benefits because there's a heavy requirement to provide proof, or just the idea that we have to have proof of these incidents is, it's a really heavy toll, but it's one that we've had to go through. So that took years for me to kind of fight for my benefits and all that. And then, the question still was at hand that the person that hurt me, that brought me harm, the perpetrator, was still in the military, and me as a survivor, I had a right to open investigation. And so, having sat with that for many years and think about, I guess my own thoughts about it, I couldn't do it while I was wearing a uniform, and a lot of members can't come forward. One of the things I live with is when you look at the sexual trauma statistics in the military, they're so staggering. But myself as an officer who was in charge of, at time hundreds of airmen, I didn't have experience with a lower ranking enlisted person coming to me for help for this event. So just to kind of name the existence of that we know that it happens, but we know that members aren't reaching out, they don't have the support. So when it came time to, like I said, when I kind of found got the help that I need, and found myself in a space where I'm strong enough to kind of, I don't know, close the loop on that justice. Like I felt like, because there was a process that said I could have justice, or there's a justice process, just for me, I thought, well, I need to engage with that, or I don't know how I would look back on this, decades later. And so I did. I came forward and I named who had harmed me, and I engaged with the military justice process, which also took almost a year and a half. And it's on my end. It's finished now, but it really disclosed to me how lacking, on both ends, for me as a survivor, but also for the harm doer, how the process really doesn't serve, doesn't serve for us to improve as a society, for us to learn from all of this. So yeah.
Yeah, because the consequences for the perpetrator are usually pretty severe, right?
They are. I mean, it's jail. They're threatened with military and incarceration, and really that's where it's going. And I think that's again a really long, that's a discussion to be had, because there's violent crimes in the military, we know this, and lots of child abuse, child sexual abuse, that I've heard about. And so whether who is deserving of that is a conversation, but for me, when I thought about my situation, and I just didn't think that years after it had occurred, which I wish we addressed it immediately. I wish my harm doer had some kind of process where he would receive, the process would of healing and justice would reach out to him when it happened. But yeah, the punishment is military jail, or being discharged from the military dishonorably, which would mean that they would also lose their benefits to the VA for mental health, for education. So yeah.
Yeah. The irony of policies that make the victim really go through these arduous processes to be able to prove what had happened, and to really engage all the appropriate people that need to investigate. It's so arduous that, like you said already, it makes people not want to go through the process, which is silencing. That's a form of silencing, having these arduous processes that make justice incredibly difficult to be able to receive. But how do we ever really know that process or that policy is messed up, or that it needs to be fixed, until someone actually goes through that process and can speak to the emotional labor of having to unpack what's happened to you, and someone still being fully employed while what you've experienced. And so I think it's a great and unfortunate irony. And I think it's also very powerful that you did go through that experience, and you did allow that healing process for yourself, and also that healing process for your perpetrator, and recognizing still his humanity, and then also the, you know, the lack of humanity that exists in a lot of our forms of retribution, which includes incarceration, which includes stripping people of, you know, very basic human rights. You know, what good is that necessarily going to do? And so I think that's a powerful stance. I'm hoping you could speak very briefly to what are some of the common stressors or common traumas that service members experience that would need very clearly make it necessary for them to have access to resources and skills and therapists for coping.
Absolutely. Yeah, so something that I already mentioned is obviously combat trauma, which in my experience, you don't necessarily, you know, have to be deployed to a combat location. You know, a place where combat is happening, but there's all kinds of military exercises that cause injury, physical, or you know, mental. They may have an impact on you. Like the combat trauma, we also, I mean, obviously we're seeing a lot of traumatic brain injury with veterans that have been deployed to these wars that are at this point are global, you know, globally at so many locations across this this planet. As well as, like I said, military sexual trauma. You know, this wasn't my experience, but a lot of survivors that report in the military are then facing really negative culture, and a lot of times will be punished themselves within their unit by their commanders with whatever they're going through. But that's the typical, you know, response that we know is happening and people have to deal with. And it's you know, this may stretch many months if there's investigations, if there's and that can be, it can be really heavy. I mean, it's really heavy to kind of carry and be with. Yeah, and it's really traumatic. But I think, you know, and this is, I may be missing some, but another injury that I think is less talked about in kind of you know, in our culture is moral injury. And that's something that, you know, about-face veterans really get at. And that's really sitting with the fact that, you know, the things that you were part of, the things that is referred to as service, you know, you return and you kind of have time to acclimate and to learn and to put in perspective what you were part of, and there's a deep and heavy injury to the harm that you were part of, you know, on other nations and such. So the moral injury is one as well. Yeah, I think that covers the chunk of it, but yeah.
Yeah, and Ksenia, final question, because the trauma that service members face is pretty unreal. Those of us who don't serve, we're really not aware of how traumatic it can be beyond what's, you know, shared with us in, let's say, the media, or if, you know, we might have family members who, you know, are trying to cope from that trauma. Could you speak just very briefly about the irony of putting our service members in conditions where we know that they are going to experience incredibly high levels of trauma, but also criminalizing and penalizing drug use for those who serve?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this was something that is, you know, a regular practice in the military is, again, you know, just speaking to my experience, being an officer and, you know, with airmen returning back from combat, and you really, you know, sometimes you're giving 2 weeks maximum to kind of recalibrate, rest and recover, but that's really not enough, you know, to really, to really return to normal, if any normal is going to be after that. But and so then you're having to come back to work, and so there is, you know, self-medication. Heavy drinking for the military is definitely a theme, because that is legal, versus you know, other drugs that are not. And so I experienced airmen and that do self-medicate, and then are put through administrative and disciplinary actions to either be, you know, kicked out of the military, but they're essentially given a dishonorable discharge. And you know, there's different levels of it, but yeah, this was a normal practice. You know, this was a practice that, again, it's kind of the military culture, and the norms and you know, aspirations of what we should live up to, that to really like punish when people are just really just trying to deal with what they lived through.
Yeah. You know, one of the punishments that I thought was really interesting is that you could be stripped of your benefits for if you cope in the wrong way with the trauma that you've experienced through your service. You could very well lose the very benefits that you were given through that service. And I think that's a very, very unfortunate and ironic consequence. And a fact that you shared with me that I thought was very interesting, that there's actually been a rise in the number of service members who've lost their benefits from 1%. Yeah, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I had to kind of freshen myself on the statistic a little bit, but it's you know, from what I've read, and during World War II was about 1% that were given these type of discharges, and it raised to 2-3% in the Vietnam era. And I've heard a percentage of 15% of post 9/11 veterans. Now I looked up online, it's 6-7%, but you know, these are hundreds of thousands of people. So no matter the percentage, I think each individual story is really, you know, a really heavy trial to go through, you know, to go you know, these are a lot of times enlisted members. We see higher numbers of Black service members being punished harsher. Absolutely. That again, you know, raise their hand to serve this country. They go deploy, and then they can be 2021 to be, you know, kicked out of the military, and on top of that, without any benefits. So yeah, I think, you know, I didn't know this. I didn't know this either while I was in the military. You know, I left the military, and I really wanted to learn more about all this, and obviously kind of just understand what I was a part of, like I said. So it's kind of, you know, looking back, it's when you're in that system, and you're taught as like, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. And it's such a you know, it's a system that, like I said, like punishes, and kind of these are the values that it puts forward, but it leaves so many traumatized in such ways.
Yeah. Ksenia, thank you so much for sharing all that. I'm going to bring on our next guest. I'm going to remove you from the stream real quick and then bring you back in at the end. I got to scroll a little bit to do that first. So our next guest is my colleague, California State Director at the Drug Policy Alliance, Jeanette Zenapatine. Hi, Jeanette. How you doing?
Hi. Good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that you can join today. One of the reasons I'm really excited about having you on is because of some of the context that was given to me through my work with Safety First about a reason why kids might be using drugs or showing up to school high, right? And so one of our pilot teachers was actually talking about the fact that, you know, he was like, if I know that a student of mine has a parent that just got deported and they've been sad, And so I know that they smoke cannabis before they come to school, and I know that they're high in my class. I'm not going to punish that kid for, coping as best as they can with something so traumatic. And
Right.
I thought that was a powerful statement. It's not an uncommon kind of pain and trauma to have to sit with as a young person. And through that, I learned some very staggering statistics around the fact that you're several times more likely to develop a substance use disorder if you have a family member that's been deported. And it's not an easy experience to cope through. And so I'm hoping you could speak a little bit more about that, about the impact of deportation policies on families and particularly on young people in their performance at school.
Yes. So, we all know that with the Trump administration, ICE enforcement has been a little bit more visible than before. Obviously, the Obama administration has a reputation of deporting the highest number of immigrants that any administration had ever deported. But with the Trump administration, given the rhetoric that we've seen around his political campaign and just the day-to-day operation, there's just this bigger attention being paid to what's happening with ICE enforcement, and so that has already caused so much stress and anxiety for all immigrants here in the United States, but especially for Latino immigrants, right? Because we have a president who has clearly demarcated folks from Latin America as the most vile, most criminal. Um, of all immigrants. And so with that rhetoric, I think a lot of kids have been under a lot of pressure, feeling those stressors of being the other and not being part of this country. And so when you layer on top of all that really awful rhetoric for children, um, the fact that family members or friends are getting deported or their friends' parents have gotten deported, all of this seems a lot more real. I mean, right after the President Trump was elected into office, I often do know your rights presentations. I'm also an immigration attorney, as my area of expertise. And every time I do a presentation, folks just want to come talk to me and just ask questions. But I have to say, right after the 2016 election, and I would do these presentations within my community, folks would be so hesitant to even ask me a question after the presentation, which I thought was shocking, but I understood it, right? Because you could feel the fear and anxiety, that this community has been under for the last couple of years, especially with this administration. And when you compound the issues of ICE raids, whether it's at the workplace, whether it's a community, we've all seen videos of the dad who got deported, driving his children to middle school, right? The ICE agents posed as police officers, pull the guy over, and it turned out that those fake police officers were ICE agents, and they immediately arrested the dad in front of his two daughters. And so when you see that kind of footage, that reality, over and over with these other images and messages, it's not hard to understand how much stress and anxiety immigrants and especially their children are under, especially for children. I think once the parents are deported or once the parents are in detention centers, the incidence for things like eating disorders, sleeping disorders, depression, anxiety, all of that just increases for our youth. And so we immediately see those manifestations within children, especially. And you have to think about all the stressors, right? I think what most folks don't realize is and I try to compare it to the criminal justice system. I think with the criminal justice system in our country, we have a sense of like, okay, you get arrested, you get booked and arraigned, there's this process, they might have a public defender assigned, and you kind of know what the process is going to be like. In immigration detention, it's completely upended all the time. Once someone is detained in a facility, the immigration officers, the detention officers, they're all trying to get you to sign your deportation. They don't want folks to have a hearing. They will do everything they can to manipulate you, to get you to sign your deportation order. And so that process is so unknown, which I think causes so much more stress for families and for
Okay.
children. And so, that whole unknown process is what really, I think, is also and no one's really looked at that part of it, but I think that that's really what causes the higher incidence of drugs and alcohol use. We recently had a study that came out a couple of months ago, maybe 2 months ago now, that actually looked at if you have a friend or a family member that is detained or has been deported, those numbers for drug use and for alcohol use were actually higher for that control group. And so we're actually seeing the first phases of how deportation and detention actually impact individuals. But getting back to the children, when you think about all the anxiety and stressors, a lot of kids, have the main breadwinner who is in detention. So everything's unstable in that household, from their home to food to who's working in the home and who's not. A lot of times, children have to be care providers for their younger brothers and sisters, maybe for older or sick relatives at that point. And so, when you look at all these different stressors kids are under, it makes a lot of sense that we're seeing children cope in different ways. And the other component, obviously, too, is for folks who are lower income or undocumented, they may not have access to either healthcare or mental health. And so those issues, I think, are really prevalent in our community, having that lack of access to care. But also just, all of these issues are taboo for immigrant communities, right? Accessing mental health care, drug use, even alcohol use. It's stuff that folks would rather just sweep under the rug and not talk about, as opposed to addressing and really dealing with the day-to-day issues. And so all of those stressors combined with that environment layered with sort of what's going on in their external world creates all those stressors. And so it all sort of flows from that. It all flows in that manner for children in terms of really understanding how much pressure and stress and anxiety our youth are under, and we definitely see those ramifications within academic performance.
And I'm understanding the pressure around being silent, and then also the kind of inherent silence that can come within the ways in which policies are created, specifically for immigrant or undocumented communities. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how the Trump administration is addressing our undocumented communities here in the U.S. within the context of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so they're not doing a good job. So we just got the stimulus package passed about a week ago. Folks that don't have a social security number were not included in that package. So anybody who is undocumented, folks who use what's called an individual tax identification number. Most folks don't realize that undocumented folks do pay taxes. And so the federal government doesn't discriminate from accessing those tax dollars from undocumented folks, but when it comes to providing services, the federal government has always had a history of ignoring this community. And so, in terms of the economic stimulus, there's nothing out there for folks from this administration. And in terms of the immigration component, the Trump administration is turning away folks at the border. Additionally, before COVID, they had the stay in Mexico policy where folks present themselves to the border, they get their name taken down or registered, and they have to wait in Mexico or another country to apply for asylum. Since the epidemic or the pandemic has occurred, what the Trump administration has ordered is for folks who they're just turning away asylum seekers at this point. So they're sending them back to, camps, unsafe conditions, unsanitary conditions, for folks to just wait outside of the country. And so they haven't really done anything to address to address the whole COVID or pandemic issue really at the border. Within the U.S., we have about I'm going to guess we have around 40,000 people in detention right now, in immigrant detention. It might be higher, but the administration has not done anything in terms of really providing any healthcare delivery, any mental health services, or even just basic protection from the pandemic. We have a detention center here in California. It's probably one of the most notorious ones. It's Otay Mesa detention center. It's a jail plus an immigrant detention center. We're hearing reports that folks do not have access to any medication. They just delivered about they just delivered um, masks to the detainees about a week ago, but they were actually asking detainees in the immigrant detention side to sign a contract saying that they would hold the corporation that runs the detention center harmless from any future litigation. And so detainees immediately said, "We're not going to do this." They arrested three of the women that were in the detention center, and then the detainees waged a hunger strike to ask for the release of those women and to not sign those contracts. And so there was, I believe, there was about 6 hours span where this all was happening, and then the company decided to deliver the mask to the detainees without having them sign these contracts. So even in detention, they're still putting up more obstacles and more barriers for folks to get any type of relief. The other reports that we're hearing from folks is that they're asking detainees to clean their side of the detention center with just rags, no cleaning supplies, no anything. They've also, if someone presents themselves with flu-like symptoms, they're giving detainees packets of salt and asking them to do salt water rinses and providing Tylenol. And that's the extent of the healthcare that folks have been getting at this particular center. So we're not seeing the administration at all address this issue. And we all know that the public health of all of us depends on everybody here. And so to do that is just really irresponsible.
Absolutely. Wow. Irresponsible, lazy,
All of it, yes.
short-sighted. It's just blowing my mind. It's going to take a bit to set in.
Well, I think too. I think what I found very moving was that I did hear audio of some of the folks that were in OT detention center speak out about their conditions, and what I found really moving was that the women were saying, we're just asking for basic human rights, and I love how the U.S. forgets that we require that of everybody else, but we don't have that mirror up against us ourselves. And so right now is one of those moments where we definitely have that mirror in front of us, and we need to respond to the cries of those women who are basically saying we want our human rights preserved, and we want to be treated like human beings and not like animals. And that's really what's happening in a lot of these detention centers.
Very well stated, Jeanette. I mean, the federal government is doing a horrible job at really protecting the undocumented community. However, there are a few, I think at least the governor in California, as well as the mayor in Chicago, are intervening a lot earlier before, and not encouraging the detention of anyone that's undocumented at this point. Could you speak a bit about more local efforts to protect undocumented immigrants during COVID?
Yeah, so DPA, both at the California base and nationally, we are working on decarceration efforts for both folks that are in jail or prisons and in detention centers. And so we've been doing that both at the local, state, and federal level. But here in California, we've been working really closely with our governor to understand sort of this whole component about what's happening in the detention centers, and also what kind of, why or how undocumented folks were left out of the relief package, the economic stimulus package. So our governor has already pledged to provide a relief fund for undocumented folks. California has always cut across the grain in terms of what's happening in our neighboring states. I mean, we neighbor Arizona. We're not too far behind from Texas, and so geographically in the Southwest has been a conservative hotspot, but California has sort of been this state where we really do value the contributions that immigrants make to California. We're not the fifth largest economy for nothing. I mean, we're built on the back of our economy really depends on the back of immigrants and the most vulnerable. And so to that end, California has try to cut across the grain and not be like some of our neighboring states. And so I really commend our governor to continue in that legacy that we've been able to build in California. And so he has already pledged to create a relief fund. We're one of the first states that offer health care to folks that are 25 or younger who are low income through our state funded Medi-Cal program. We're slated to provide um, coverage for seniors 65 and over this year. The governor already pledged to do that as well. And so we're taking all these incremental steps to try to get us to universal health care in California. And a big part of that is including our undocumented population. The mayor of Chicago was also one of the first mayors to come out and say that she's also going to create a relief fund for her undocumented population along the same lines, valuing the contributions of their immigrant community, acknowledging that the hardest hit of this pandemic are those frontline vulnerable workers that, and many of them are immigrants. And so she is also going to assure that undocumented folks can benefit from their housing programs, from assistance with public schools, that resources that children might need, uh, you know, most likely, internet access to help kids. But she's pledged strong support to her undocumented community, pretty much along the same lines as our governor, acknowledging the many contributions that immigrants have made to the city of Chicago.
I really appreciate you sharing. I really appreciate the effort that's being made to really highlight how our most vulnerable populations are being impacted by COVID-19. And I really appreciate all the effort and the footwork and the hustle that's happening to really highlight that, as well as, shift policies and really get into the ears of decision makers so that we can really take advantage and, like you said, push towards universal health care. Because if it's not obvious at this point that this is, first of all, it's a basic human right, like you said, but if it's not obvious at this point that that's something that's going to protect all of us, I don't know how else it could be. So I'm going to go ahead and add back Kim and Ksenia into the stream. Welcome back. There's a couple of closing questions that I just want to ask all of you. Again, the theme of this is why we cope, really, speaking to the more marginalized issues that impact so many of us, and the processes of retribution, healing, and justice, and how we can really do better than what we've been doing in the past. So one question I have, and this is for all of you, but specifically Kim and Ksenia, is why are restorative justice approaches important for the well-being of victims seeking justice? Oh, Kim, we can't hear you. No, girl. All right, try it again. I can't hear you. Do me a favor, do us a favor. I know it's like that. It's Monday. We talked about that. That was the first thing we talked about. So maybe try to exit the stream, come back in. And in the meantime, Ksenia, if you could speak a little bit about, what is the power and what's the value of using a restorative justice approach as, a victim of any sort as you're seeking justice.
Yes. Make sure you hear me.
Yeah, I hear you fine. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I myself am just starting out from this, but I think just through my personal story, when I went through this process of seeking justice, and like I said, it's been over like five years that I've been entangled in it, and I thought about it, and from my roots, where I come from, I don't want more jails. I don't want to send. I don't think that's and it's not a restorative process for me, for the perpetrator, and for our communities. And so I started to dig into it and really understand that, understanding the spectrum of like victim harm doer, because realizing that in some ways I've been a harm doer. And so, yeah, I just, I would have, having, again, being on the finished process sort of my journey, of my justice process, I really wish it would have gone a whole different way than it did, than it currently does. It just really doesn't serve the people involved, whether they've been harmed or they were the harm doers.
Thank you for that. Kim, I'm about to add you back into the stream. Can I hear you now? I can't hear you. I know. Nope. Nope. What if you had tried disconnecting your earphones and just using your device?
No.
Still no luck. No. That's all right. We're going to troubleshoot it. We're going to figure that out. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to the next question. And it's for all of you, because it's really what we're doing and it's the point of this episode. But why is it important to uplift and insert marginalized voices into public narratives at a moment like this?
Yeah, I'll go ahead if you guys can hear me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
I just think it's really important to uplift the most marginalized folks. Often folks forget about these communities. We're really lucky to work with some of these communities and really hear their stories and really understand what they're going through. And I think when we look at some of the folks that are the most marginalized, I think it's really important to understand that oftentimes folks walk around without any hope. And I think the folks, I often joke with my husband, he thinks I have to be an optimist to do this work. And so, for me to be able to to do this work, you have to have some layer of hope. And so to really uplift those stories is just to really, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of look at it, is looking at a mirror of ourselves in our own society and how we create a better society. How do we create a society that really um, represents our values in every way? And so we really have to look at things like decarceration efforts, like breaking down things and abolishing ICE, and really looking at the harms that they're doing to our communities. I think more people seem to be more aware of these issues. I'm just hoping that we're able to change hearts, minds, and policy around all of these issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to end it here because we're a little bit over the hour. I see Kim trying to come back into the stream. Let's see what happens.
No.
We can't hear you. Kim, how about this? Here's the trade-off. Do this. I know, not today, Satan. Sometimes Satan sneaks up a little bit. So you'll play. It's okay. We have our head on the swivel. Here's what I want you to do. Any information that you think will be good for people to look up on their own time, either about Red Hook Initiative or the HIV Stops With Me campaign, send me a link or put a link in the chat, and we're going to add that to the description box under this video. How about that? It's 2020. That's what we just want. Yeah. We'll send a link. Okay, that's what we're gonna do. I want to thank each of you for coming on today and sharing your story, sharing your work. I had a blast with each of you, and it was, your stories are incredible and powerful. And I think it's such an important and empowering moment to really speak, like Jeanette said, speak these stories of the margin, speak these stories that are often silenced, either through the arduousness of seeking retribution or just through, the very people who were perpetuating violence or oppression, either through, policy or through assault. These are powerful stories, and right now is a very powerful time to share them. And so I just want to really thank each of you for that.
Thank you, Sasha.
Of course. So I've got a few episode takeaways. I'm gonna share my screen with you guys. Add this in here, add it to the stream. There we go. So some episode takeaways. we all experience trauma in life, and we need skills, we need resources, and we need support to cope. It's not a matter of if, but when. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, we often kind of frame the conversation around mental health for young people as if it's an if thing, as if it's a you might go through something traumatic. You might experience something that you never anticipated. You might, like it's not a might thing. We're adults. We know stuff happens. We even know that we were speaking earlier with Jeanette, things happen to young people, right? Or even Kim sharing her story around being, forced into therapy as a young person. There's no reason to keep that a secret or to keep that vague to young people at all. So it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when. So it's really important to recognize that we have reasons to cope. We have issues, and that is okay. We're human. And it's important to have the resources and skills to be able to cope. The next page. And fortunately and not, the COVID-19 pandemic has given us an opportunity to expose this truth to young people and to highlight the necessity of mental hygiene and mental wellness in our lives. Overwhelmingly, I'm being contacted by people from youth serving organizations that are looking for mental health resources for their young people. They are very much concerned about how their students are coping, how their children are coping, being at home, being isolated, not being able to see their friends. There's a lot of concern. So we can't hide it anymore. There's a whole lot that we can't hide anymore from young people, which is one thing I really value about this moment, is that those deeper, darker, and more painful truths about life have been exposed and are being exposed. But while they're here, while they're being revealed, it is an incredible moment to really speak to. And there's a next step. And there's a next step that is engaged in healing, that's engaged in recovery, and that's engaged in really taking ownership of your own health and finding the support that you need, and you're going to be okay. And it's important to learn that skill early, because you're probably going to have to repeat it a few times over. Also, policies themselves, they can put us in the position of being the perpetrator or victim of trauma. Many of us have been on either side. And how we carry out and seek justice matters. We already know that incarceration doesn't help anyone. Across the board, especially when it comes to really improving mental health, or really improving the circumstances that, had anyone be incarcerated in the first place. And oftentimes we're incarcerating people for very low-level offenses, and specifically low-level drug offenses. So is it worth forcing the trauma of American incarceration on a person for a low-level drug offense? Is it really? I don't think so, but it's really important to question that. And it's really important to question the processes and the ways in which we seek justice, and the policies in which outline what justice should look like. And if it really doesn't add up, it's okay to challenge that, and it's okay to, offer a different solution, and especially in a moment like this. And ignorance, silence, and stigma don't help. We spoke about the fact that oftentimes people are ignorant about other people's pain, because to even be able to speak to it and seek justice or retribution, that process can be so arduous, and it could be so revealing and painstaking that a lot of people just opt out. So that in itself is silencing, and that in itself allows for the stigmatization of speaking up, of seeking help, of seeking retribution. And that's not going to help us be able to cope. And that's not going to really reduce the tax on the individual, our communities, and the taxpayer, by not allowing space for people to be able to cope from the real trauma that we transgress against each other. So next episode is next Monday, same time, noon Eastern Standard Time, live on YouTube and Facebook. I want to thank today's guests for coming on. Ksenia, Kim, and Jeanette, thank you so much. And let me just take a peek at the questions real quick. We have a really busy comment board. I think we hit their questions today. All right. Well, they thanked us for the series, and I thank you guys again for coming on. It was great being able to talk with you guys and really dig into these issues. So thanks, and everybody at home, thanks for tuning in. Share it. Tune in next week. It's always a blast. Ask questions, and looking forward to next time. So, bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.